The rain was falling hard against the massive glass ceiling of the city center shopping mall, creating a constant roar of background noise that blended with the chatter of hundreds of weekend shoppers inside. It was a cold, gray Saturday, but in here, the air was warm and filled with the smell of expensive cinnamon pretzels and strong coffee. The floor was made of polished white tiles that reflected the bright store lights, and every few seconds a child would run by laughing or a group of teenagers would walk past talking loudly about their plans for the night. The mall was packed because of the weather, and people were looking for anything to do to pass the time. Right in the middle of the huge open atrium stood a beautiful grand piano. It was sleek and black, with a lid that was propped open, showing off the shiny strings. Inside, it was the kind of instrument that looked like it cost more than most people made in a year. But despite the crowd moving around it, the piano sat completely empty. It looked lonely sitting there on the small raised platform, like a stage waiting for a performer that never arrived. Most people walked right past it, without even glancing in its direction. They were too busy looking at their phones, or carrying heavy bags filled with new clothes and gadgets. The noise of the mall was overwhelming, a chaotic mix of footsteps, pop music playing from store speakers, and the constant echo of voices bouncing off the high walls. It was not a place where you would expect to find anything quiet or peaceful. Everyone was in a rush to get to the next store or the next sale. Even the people sitting on the benches near the piano were just resting their feet, not paying attention to the instrument. In front of them near the main entrance, a heavy set of glass doors slid open, and a small gust of cold wind blew in. Before the doors sealed shut again, an older woman stepped inside, bringing a little bit of the rainy weather with her. She did not look like she belonged in this fancy modern place. She was very small and thin, with a posture that was bent forward slightly, as if she was carrying a heavy invisible weight on her shoulders. She wore a long beige coat that looked like it had seen many better days. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, and the color had faded from years of washing and being out in the sun. She had a simple green scarf tied loosely around her neck, and a pair of black shoes that looked old and scuffed. She walked with a noticeable limp, dragging her right leg just a little bit with every step she took. She held onto the railing of the escalator as she slowly made her way down to the main floor. Her hands were wrapped in fingerless gloves that were starting to unravel at the edges, and she carried a worn-out leather tote bag over one shoulder. It looked heavy, and it bumped against her hip as she moved. The shoppers flowing past her did not seem to notice her at all. She was invisible to them. Just another obstacle to walk around in their busy day. A few people brushed by her accidentally because they were looking at their screens, and one younger businessman in a sharp suit had to swerve at the last second to avoid hitting her. He gave her an annoyed look as he adjusted his expensive coat and kept walking without saying a word. The woman did not seem to care about the rushing crowd or the annoyed looks. She kept her head down, watching the polished floor tiles move beneath her feet, as if she was counting them. She looked tired, very tired. The kind of tired that comes from working hard your whole life and never catching a break. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, and her hair was white and pulled back into a messy bun. She moved slowly, taking her time, while everyone else seemed to be running a race. She stopped for a moment to catch her breath, leaning against a concrete pillar near a large potted plant. She closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath, listening to the sounds of the mall around her, the beeping of registers, the hum of the escalator, the distant music from a clothing store. Then she opened her eyes and looked across the open hall. She saw the piano sitting there in the middle of the chaos. It was the only still thing in the whole building. She stared at it for a long moment, and something in her face changed just a little bit. Her eyes seemed to focus, and her grip on her bag tightened. She pushed herself off the pillar and started walking again, but this time she had a specific destination. She ignored the bright displays of the luxury stores and the smell of the food court. She headed straight for the center of the atrium. As she got closer to the piano, the people sitting on the nearby benches started to notice her. There was a group of 4 young people, probably students or maybe just friends, hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. They were dressed in trendy clothes and holding iced coffees. They had been laughing loudly and taking pictures of themselves. But they stopped talking as the old woman approached. They watched her with a look of mild curiosity mixed with confusion. The woman walked right up to the small platform where the piano was. She stepped up slowly, with difficulty, and stood in front of the bench. For a moment, she just stood there looking at the keys. She did not touch them, yet she seemed hesitant. She reached into her old tote bag and pulled out a small piece of cloth which she used to wipe something off her face. Then she smoothed down her coat with her trembling hands. The group on the benches whispered to each other. One of them, a young man with a bright blue hoodie, leaned forward and nudged his friend. He pointed at the woman and snickered quietly, assuming she was lost or confused. He thought she was going to ask for directions, or maybe just sit down to rest her legs before getting yelled away by security. The atmosphere around the piano shifted slightly. The laughter from the group became more mocking. They were amused by this old, out-of-place woman standing next to an instrument that was clearly too expensive for someone like her to touch. But the woman did not look at them. She did not look at anyone. She just stood there silently gathering her courage, preparing to do something she had not done in a very long time. She turned slowly around and faced the piano bench. It was a long black seat with leather that looked very slippery and cold. She reached out with one hand to steady herself, and then began to lower her body down. It was not an easy task, because her knees were stiff and her joints ached with every movement. She let out a small, quiet groan as she bent her knees, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the loud noise of the shoppers walking past. She had to grab the edge of the piano with her fingers to keep from falling onto the floor, and once she was finally seated, she realized the bench was too far away from the keys for her to reach comfortably. She tried to slide forward, but the bench was heavy and the rubber feet on the bottom gripped the floor strongly. She had to use her legs and push with her hands while wiggling her hips at the same time just to move the heavy wooden seat a few inches forward. The group of young people sitting on the nearby couches watched this entire struggle with great interest. They were not looking at her with kindness or concern. Instead, their faces were lit up with amusement and a bit of cruelty. The guy in the blue hoodie laughed loudly, a sharp barking sound that cut through the air, and he nudged the girl sitting next to him with his elbow. "Look at this," he said, pointing his finger directly at the woman. "She has no idea what she is doing." He leaned back and spread his arms wide, as if he was welcoming everyone to watch the show. The girl laughed too, covering her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were scanning the crowd to see who else was watching. She whispered something to the boy about the old woman probably being lost or confused, and he nodded his head in agreement. The woman could hear them laughing. She was not deaf. Her hearing was actually quite good, despite her age, and every word they said felt like a small pinch. But she did not turn around to face them. She kept her back straight and stared at the piano keys, as if they were the only things in the world that mattered. She knew what people thought when they looked at her. They saw a worn-out coat and old shoes, and a face full of wrinkles. They did not see a person with a history or a talent. They just saw someone who did not belong in their shiny, modern mall. The whispers started to spread from that small group to the people standing around waiting for the elevator. A man in a business suit glanced over his shoulder, shook his head, and looked away, probably thinking she was going to make a scene or create a disturbance. "Bet you $20 she plays chopsticks," said the boy in the hoodie, loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear him. His friends laughed even harder at this joke. One of them pulled out a phone and held it up, ready to record a video. They were hoping for something funny, something they could post online for likes and laughs. They wanted to see her fail. They wanted to see her make a fool of herself, because that was entertaining to them. The air on the piano began to feel heavy and mean. It was no longer just a busy mall. It felt like a stage where a cruel joke was about to happen. The anticipation among the small group of mockers was growing. They were leaning forward on the edge of their seats, waiting for the first terrible noise to come out of the instrument. The woman on the bench sat very still for a moment, ignoring the cameras pointed at her face. She carefully adjusted the scarf around her neck, making sure it was not in the way. Then she reached up and slowly pulled off her fingerless gloves, one finger at a time, revealing hands that were pale and spotted with age. Her knuckles were large and swollen, but her fingers were long and elegant, despite the years of hard work. She laid the gloves gently on top of her old tote bag on the floor beside her. She took a deep breath in through her nose and let it out slowly through her mouth, trying to calm her racing heart. She had not played in front of anyone for a very long time, and the fear of messing up was crawling up her spine like a spitter. The boy in the hoodie made a mocking face, pretending to be serious, and waved his hands in the air dramatically. "Come on, Grandma," he shouted, "play us a tune." He thought he was being funny, and his friends clapped and whistled. A few other people in the mall stopped walking to see what the shouting was about, and when they saw the old woman at the piano, some of them smiled too. Thinking it was a joke, they waited for the comedy to begin. The tension was high, and the noise of the mall seemed to get even louder, as if the building itself was laughing at her. The woman did not react to the shouting. She simply lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. Her hands hovered there for a second, trembling just a little bit in the air. The keys were smooth and white, and they felt cool under her fingertips. She closed her eyes for a split second and pictured a different time and place. A quiet room with sunlight streaming through a window and silence everywhere. Not this noisy, crowded place full of people who mocked her. She felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her shoulders, but she pushed it away. She shifted her weight on the bench and planted her feet firmly on the floor, even though they barely reached the pedals. The boy with the phone leaned in closer, zooming in on her face, waiting to catch. The moment she realized she could not play, he whispered to his friend that she was probably going to just bang her fists on the keys like a toddler. The group was buzzing with energy, confident that they were about to see something pathetic. They had already written her off as a joke, a crazy old lady who thought she could play music. They saw her coat and her limp, and they thought they knew everything about her. They could not have been more wrong. She flexed her fingers once, stretching them wide and then curling them into a fist. The motion was slow and deliberate. Her arthritic joints protested, but she ignored the pain. She was ready. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the noise, waiting for the mistake. The boy in the hoodie opened his mouth to make another mean comment, but before he could get the words out, the old woman moved her hands. The atmosphere shifted instantly from mocking noise to absolute readiness. She was not there to amuse them, she was there to play, and the seconds that followed would change everything in that mall forever. The young man in the blue hoodie was still leaning forward with his mouth half open, ready to shout another mean comment, but the words never left his lips, because in that exact second the old woman moved her hands. She did not press down on the keys. Gently, she struck them with a sudden and unexpected force that seemed to come from deep inside her chest. The sound that exploded from the piano was not the clumsy banging of a child or the hesitant plinking of an amateur. It was a deep, resonant chord that vibrated through the wooden floorboards and shot up the legs of everyone standing nearby. It was a sound so rich and full that it instantly sliced through the noisy chatter of the food court and the pop music playing in the clothing stores. The air in the atrium seemed to shimmer and change pressure, as if a storm had suddenly rolled in. Before the sound of that first chord could even fade away, her hands were moving again. They launched into a complex and cascading run of notes that moved faster than the eye could follow. The transition was shocking to watch. One moment she was a fragile old woman struggling to sit on a bench, and the next moment she was a blur of frantic energy. Her fingers danced across the ivory keys with a precision and power that seemed impossible for someone of her age. The arthritis that had made her hands tremble when she was holding her bag seemed to vanish completely. Her fingers were independent and strong, striking the keys with absolute confidence. The music was not a simple nursery rhyme. It was a difficult classical piece full of sharp turns and fast rhythms that required immense skill to play correctly. The group of young people who had been laughing just moments earlier froze. Instantly, the boy in the blue hoodie stopped leaning forward and sat back as if he had been pushed by an invisible hand. His eyes went wide and his jaw dropped slightly. The girl with the phone lowered her device slowly. She did not know what to do with her hands, so they just hung there at her sides. The smug smirk that had been on her face was wiped away, replaced by a look of pure confusion and disbelief. They looked at each other and then back at the old woman, unable to process what they were seeing. The person they had decided was a joke was playing music that was far beyond anything they could understand or appreciate. The cruel atmosphere that had hung over the piano vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a sudden, heavy tension. The music continued to pour out of the instrument, wave after wave of melody. It was aggressive and intense, then soft and delicate, then loud and thunderous, all within the span of a few seconds. The shoppers who were walking past on the main walkway began to slow down. One by one they stopped, turning their heads toward the sound. A businessman who was rushing toward the escalator with a briefcase in his hand stopped mid-stride and turned completely around. He forgot about his meeting and his coffee. He just stood there, listening. A mother who was pulling a complaining child toward the bathroom stopped and let go of the stroller for a moment, closing her eyes to let the sound wash over her. The background noise of the mall, the beeping of the cash registers, the humming of the escalators, the distant footsteps, all seemed to fade away into the background, as if someone had turned down the volume on the rest of the world so that only the piano could be heard. The old woman sat up straighter now. Her back was no longer hunched over and frail. She looked taller and stronger than she had when she walked into the building. Her eyes were squeezed shut as tight as they could go, blocking out the sight of the shoppers and the bright lights and the fancy stores. She was not in the mall anymore. She was somewhere else in her memory, perhaps in a concert hall years ago, or in a quiet room with people she loved. She played with a fierce intensity, her head nodding slightly to the rhythm, her body swaying with the music as the melody demanded more and more energy from her small frame. A bead of sweat formed on her forehead and glistened under the lights, but she did not wipe it away. She was entirely focused on the movement of her fingers. The piece she was playing was technically demanding. It required her hands to cross over each other, constantly stretching to reach the highest notes at the top of the keyboard, and then diving down to the deep bass notes at the bottom. Her left hand was keeping a steady and complicated rhythm, while her right hand played melodies that spun up into the air like birds flying away from the earth. It was a performance of pure mastery, and it was happening in the most unlikely place possible. The contrast between her appearance and her ability was startling everyone watching. They saw the worn-out coat and the scuffed shoes and the thin white hair, but they heard the sound of a genius, and the two things did not make sense. Together more people began to gather, forming a wide circle around the piano platform, but no one was speaking. They stood in clusters and alone, with their arms at their sides or crossed over their chests, watching with rapt attention. The silence that had fallen over the crowd was different from the silence before. Before, the silence had been filled with whispers and giggles and rude comments. This silence was a respectful one. It was the silence of people who knew they were witnessing something special and did not want to ruin it by making a sound. Even the security guards who stood by the elevators stopped looking at their phones and turned to watch. They had seen street performers before, but they had never seen anything like this. The energy in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer a place of commerce and distraction. It had become a concert hall. The music swelled to a crescendo, the sound filling the massive open space of the atrium, bouncing off the high glass ceiling and echoing off the polished tile floors. It was a wall of sound that hit the listeners in the chest, making them feel the vibration of every note. The boy in the blue hoodie looked down at his shoes, feeling a strange sense of shame that he could not quite explain. He looked at his friends and saw that they were no longer laughing. They were staring at the old woman with their mouths slightly open. The phone that had been used to mock her was now dark and forgotten in someone's hand. The power of the music was undeniable. It commanded respect, it demanded attention, and it forced everyone there to look past the surface and see the human soul underneath the ragged clothes. As she played, the woman seemed to shed years of her life. Her movements became fluid and graceful. The limp that had made her walk so slowly was gone. While she was seated at the bench, she was whole and complete. She was using every bit of strength she had left to pour her life story into the instrument. She was communicating without words, a language that everyone there could understand, regardless of their age or their background. The music told stories of love and loss, of hard times and good times, of pain and joy. It was a raw and honest display of emotion that caught everyone off guard, because they were so used to hearing processed and perfect music over speakers all day long. This was real. This was human. And it was happening right in front of them. The sound coming from the instrument was not just music. It was a living thing that seemed to breathe and pulse through the air of the mall. The melody changed from the fast and complicated notes to a slow and hauntingly beautiful section that felt like a sad story being told without words. The notes were heavy and full of emotion. They hung in the air for a long time before fading away. It was the kind of music that reaches deep inside you and grabs hold of something you did not even know was there. People who had been rushing to get to the next store or the next sale found themselves stopping in their tracks, unable to move their feet. They were drawn in by the raw power of the sound. The circle of people around the piano had grown much larger. Now, what started as a small group of teenagers had turned into a crowd of 50 or 60 people. They were standing 3 or 4 rows deep, surrounding the small platform. Everyone was facing the same direction, looking at the small woman hunched over the keys. There was no pushing or shoving, even though the crowd was getting bigger, because nobody wanted to make a noise that would break the spell they were all under. It was as if the entire mall had been placed under a magic spell that froze time and stopped the noise of the busy world. The young man in the blue hoodie, who had been so cruel and loud just minutes earlier, was now standing perfectly still. His face had lost its color and his smirk was long gone. He was looking at the floor, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable and ashamed. He realized now that he had made a terrible mistake. He judged a book by its cover, and he had been completely wrong. The phone in his hand felt heavy and useless. He did not dare look up at the woman, because he felt a sudden sharp pang of guilt in his chest that he could not ignore. He glanced at his friends and saw that they looked exactly the same. They were no longer laughing at her, they were listening to her and realizing that she possessed a gift that they could never understand. A store manager, who had stepped out of his shop to see what was causing the delay in foot traffic, stood near the back of the crowd with his arms crossed over his chest. He intended to tell the woman to move along or tell the crowd to disperse, because they were blocking the entrance. But as he listened, he forgot all about business and sales figures. He uncrossed his arms and let them hang loose by his sides. His eyes softened as he watched her play. He saw the way her hands moved and the expression of deep concentration on her face. And he realized that he was witnessing something that money could not buy. Silence that fell over the area was absolute and heavy. It was a physical weight that could be felt pressing down on everyone there. Usually a mall is a place of constant noise and distraction. But now, the only sound that mattered was the music coming from the grand piano. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, and the rain still beat against the glass roof far above. But no one heard those sounds anymore. Their ears were tuned only to the melody. The silence between the notes was just as powerful as the notes themselves. The crowd held their breath during the quiet parts, waiting to see what would come next, afraid that if they exhaled too loudly, they might scare the music away. Children who had been running around and shouting only a few moments before stood quietly holding onto their parents' legs or watching with wide eyes and open mouths. Even the youngest child seemed to sense that something important was happening, something that required them to be quiet and respectful. The music had a way of leveling the playing field. It did not matter if you were rich or poor, young or old, educated or uneducated. When the music played, everyone was the same. Everyone was just a listener feeling the same emotions. The woman played on. With her eyes still closed tight, she was sweating now, and her breathing was heavy. But she did not stop. Her fingers moved with a life of their own, finding the right keys without her even looking. She was pouring decades of joy and sorrow into the instrument. Every note seemed to carry a memory, a feeling, a loss, or a triumph. The sound was so pure and so honest that it made some people feel like crying without knowing exactly why. It was a release of emotion that most people kept bottled up inside themselves every single day. But hearing it played out loud made them feel connected to each author. As the piece reached its middle section, the tempo began to pick up speed again. The notes came faster and harder, building up tension and energy. Once more the sound grew louder, filling the entire atrium. The vibrations could be felt in the floor tiles under the feet of the crowd. The music was demanding and aggressive. It took hold of the attention of everyone there and refused to let go. The shoppers who were just passing by on the upper floors stopped at the glass railings and looked down to see where the sound was coming from. People on the escalators craned their necks to get a look at the source of the beautiful noise. The entire mall seemed to stop functioning and just listen. Tension in the music grew tighter and tighter, like a rubber band being stretched to its breaking point. The notes were cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall of sound. It was dizzying to watch her hands move so quickly, yet so gracefully. The crowd was mesmerized, completely captured by the performance. The young man in the blue hoodie looked up finally and watched her hands. He saw the wrinkles and the age spots, but he also saw the speed and the precision, and he realized that he knew nothing about this woman or her life. He felt very small in that moment, standing in front of a true master of art, while he was just a person with a phone who made fun of strangers. Atmosphere was no longer one of mockery or judgment. It was transformed into a place of reverence and awe. The cruel words from earlier were forgotten, erased by the overwhelming beauty of the sound. The air seemed to vibrate with energy. The crowd was silent, not because they were told to be, but because they wanted to be. They did not want to miss a single note of the incredible performance that was unfolding right in front of them. The sound washed over them, cleansing the bad vibes and replacing them with something real and tangible. The woman who had been invisible to them just a short while ago was now the most important person in the building, and every eye was fixed on her with respect and wonder. The music built up to a final dramatic rush of notes. Her hands were moving so fast that they were almost a blur. The sound was intense and powerful, filling every corner of the vast atrium. It felt like the piano was singing as loud as it possibly could, reaching a peak that the audience did not know was coming. And then with one final sudden motion, she struck the last chord with both hands. It was a loud, solid sound that seemed to shake the floor beneath the feet of the crowd. The sound rang out deep and full, echoing off the high glass ceiling and bouncing around the open space like a thunderclap on a clear day. And then she lifted her hands off the keys. Instant light silence that followed was absolute and heavy. It was not the quiet of an empty room, but the tense, charged silence of hundreds of people holding their breath at the same time. The final note seemed to hang in the air, vibrating and alive for a long time before it began to fade away. No one moved. No one spoke. No one coughed or shifted their weight. The entire crowd was frozen, staring at the woman with the piano still ringing in their ears. The young man in the blue hoodie stood with his mouth open, staring at the woman. His hands were hanging loosely at his sides and his eyes were wide. He felt like he had been punched in the stomach. All the air had left his body, and he could not find the words to speak. Even if he wanted to. The woman sat with her hands resting on her lap for a moment, her eyes still closed. She did not turn around to see the faces of the people who had mocked her only minutes before. She did not look for approval or applause. She just sat there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the performance. She seemed to be in her own world, completely unaware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon her with awe and respect. The contrast between the frail old woman and the powerful music she had just created was too much for the crowd to process. Their brains were trying to understand what they had just witnessed, and how they could have been so wrong about her. Slowly the reality of the situation began to sink back in. The silence was broken not by a whisper or a laugh, but by the sound of a single person clapping. It was an older man standing near the back, who had tears in his eyes. He clapped slowly and deliberately, with the heavy thud of his palms meeting together. Then another person joined in, and then another, and then suddenly, the entire crowd erupted into applause. It was not the polite clapping that people give to street musicians when they walk by. It was a loud, thunderous roar of appreciation. People were whistling and cheering, shouting bravo and beautiful. The sound was overwhelming, washing over the small woman on the bench like a wave. But she did not bow or acknowledge it. Group of teenagers who had been so cruel earlier stood in stunned silence amidst the cheering. They felt small and foolish. The boy in the hoodie looked at his phone and then quickly put it away in his pocket as if hiding it. He did not feel like recording anymore. He felt a deep sense of shame that burned his cheeks. He realized he had tried to hurt someone who was clearly a master, and he felt terrible about it. The girl with the coffee just stared at the woman with a look of pure wonder. Realizing that true art comes from places you would never expect, the woman on the bench finally opened her eyes and looked down at her hands as if surprised to see them there. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The energy that had possessed her during the song seemed to drain away, leaving her looking tired and old again. She reached out and gently lowered the lid over the keys, closing the piano with a soft click. The sound signaled that the experience was over and the spell was broken. She moved slowly and deliberately, reaching down to the floor to pick up her gloves. She put them back on her hands, one finger at a time, covering the skin that had just created such magic. She reached down and grabbed the handle of her worn leather tote bag, pulling it up onto her lap and then sliding it over her shoulder to rest where it had been before. She gripped the edge of the bench with both hands and pushed herself up. It was a struggle and her legs shook a little bit with the effort. She was not the powerful musician anymore. She was just an old lady with a limp. Getting up from a seat, she stood up slowly and straightened her coat, pulling the hem down to make herself look presentable. The crowd watched her stand up and began to quiet down a little bit as they sensed she was leaving. Some people stepped forward, wanting to talk to her or ask her name or shake her hand. But she did not look at them. She turned her back on the piano and the crowd and faced the direction of the mall exit. The people in the front rows saw that she was not seeking fame or attention. She simply wanted to go home. The sea of people parted for her, automatically creating a clear path for her to walk through. No one blocked her way, no one laughed, and no one pointed. They just watched her with reverence, as if she was royalty. Walking through a humble village, walked with her pronounced limp, dragging her right foot slightly, just as she had when she entered the mall. The sound of her shuffling steps was quiet but audible in the space between the shops. The boy in the blue hoodie moved aside quickly to let her pass, lowering his head so he would not have to make eye contact. He could not bring himself to look at her face because he felt so guilty about his earlier behavior. He wanted to say sorry, but the words were stuck in his throat, so he just stepped out of the way and watched her feet move past him. She walked past the storefronts with their bright lights and mannequins without glancing at them. She did not look left or right. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant glass doors that led out to the rainy street. The sound of the mall started to return slowly. The hum of conversations, the beeping of registers, and the sound of children playing. But it felt different now. The atmosphere had changed. The people who were there felt different. They felt like they had shared a special moment together, a secret gift from a stranger. As she reached the main exit, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, letting in a blast of cold, wet air from outside. She stepped through the doors and out into the light rain. She did not put up an umbrella or quicken her pace. She just walked out into the weather, becoming a small silhouette against the gray city sky. The people inside watched through the glass as she got smaller and smaller in the distance until she finally turned a corner and disappeared completely back inside the mall. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but no one was in a rush to get back to their shopping. They stood in small groups, talking quietly about what they had seen, trying to describe the feeling of the music and the shock of the performance. The piano sat empty again on its platform, black and silent, waiting for the next person to sit down. But everyone knew that no one would ever play it quite like that again. The young man in the hoodie stood by the railing for a long time, looking at the empty bench. He made a silent promise to himself that he would never judge a stranger by their appearance again, because you never know what kind of music is hiding inside a person until you stop talking long enough to listen.